Perfect. So hi everyone, my name is Caleb Robinson. I'm a research scientist here at Microsoft, based out of Seattle, in the US and Washington. I'm going to talk about work that we've previously worked on with Lacey and Jared on detecting cattle and elk from satellite imagery. So I was going back to put these slides together. I thought the title slide was a little bit boring, so I had on the topic of AI and using AI, an AI model generate an image of a cow eating grass while being monitored by a spaceship. And this is what it spit out. So I thought that was a great addition to the slide. So to motivate this work, we want to answer two questions. Why do we care where cattle are, and why are we using satellite imagery? This is probably not necessary for this crowd, as this entire workshop's about these questions. But one really important reason is that being able to do cattle surveys over large areas really let us study phenomenon like the Serengeti Mara squeeze. And finding cattle in satellite imagery with automated approaches enable us to perform these surveys over large areas. So the Serengeti Mara squeeze is the term given to human activity around the borders of the Serengeti Mara ecosystem. This can include things like, for example, farmers slowly moving their cattle into protected areas and disrupting wildlife in the process. And the idea is if we know where the cattle are in relationship to the ecosystem, we can determine where the squeeze is happening, i.e. where farmers are encroaching and how that might be changing over time. So another reason that finding cattle is important is for studying potential conflicts between newly introduced wild animals and cattle at the rangeland-wildland interface. This is work that has been previously done by Lacey. Spent a lot of time on this topic. And this really requires knowing where both cattle and wildlife are over time. And previous efforts have spent huge amounts of time with manual labeling to determine where these animals are. And then finally, cattle are actually a vital component of many economies around the world. In Uruguay, for example, there are 4 cows per person, and beef is their largest export with over $1 billion USD annually. Now, from a machine learning standpoint, performing these aerial surveys can be cast as a computer vision problem. You want to train a model that takes as input satellite imagery and solves one of two problems. A localization problem, where you're trying to determine where in the satellite image each individual animal is, or a counting problem where you're trying to summarize the total number of animals in the image. And as an aside, to actually do this, you need imagery that is very high resolution. 0.3 centimeters or better, or 0.3 meters or better is preferred. 0.5 meters per pixel is on the kind of low end of what's possible. You can't really identify animals when you have resolution that is that low. And here you're really restricted to the regime of commercial satellite imagery, specifically from Maxar, from their WorldView 2 or 3 satellites that can capture panchromatic imagery at a resolution of 30 centimeters per pixel. So the problem of detecting kind of large mammals in imagery has been studied in several different research threads. I know there was a talk earlier on today, I think, about exactly this with the wildebeest work from the amazing collaborators at the University of Twente. And this paper that I'm showing here was a really great paper on counting cows from high-resolution satellite imagery from the NeurIPS 2020 Climate Change and AI workshop. And here the idea was that the authors were going to train models that achieve a mean average percentage error performance between 20% and 40%. But they study how the model is performing on patches of imagery that are sampled around large cattle ranches. So just a priori, they know that the images that they're putting through the model are very likely to have cows in it. And that means that the performance that they're measuring isn't indicative of how the model is going to perform when it's applied over a huge landscape, for example, imagery over the entire Serengeti Mara. And this aspect of this, how to evaluate models that are running on, that are performing this task, is a key aspect of the work that we did here. We do two things. One, focus on evaluating the temporal generalization performance of a variety of different counting and localization approaches. So the two ways of approaching this problem that I mentioned previously. And the second thing that we do is propose metrics for measuring the performance of these models over large landscapes and when the actual label source that you have is noisy. And actually, before I get into this, any questions on the setup of the problem? I don't remember if I mentioned it, but if there are, please feel free to jump in.
Anybody have questions at this point?
I'll just pause.
I think we're good, Caleb, right now. Thanks.
Great. So the data set that we used for this study consisted of 11 satellite images over the Point Reyes National Seashore. This is in kind of central California. And here, each of the scenes had a spatial resolution ranging from 30 centimeters to 50 centimeters in the panchromatic band. They were taken between 2013 and 2018, and all were exhaustively annotated for cattle and elk locations for a total of 10,500 point annotations. This is just an example of what this looks like. Here you can see Point Reyes, and this is the panchromatic band, so this is not color, and it's around 30,000 by 30,000 pixels. See if I can get this out of the way. So the first, or one of the large problems in this work is that each label that we have isn't precisely aligned with a corresponding object in the image. So here, for example, in the image on the right, you can see that the labeled point, which is the small green dot, is offset from the corresponding cow that it's supposed to be annotating. And the reason for this is because the data set was created by ecologists for ecology purposes and not for training machine learning models. But when you are training machine learning models, the more precise your annotations are, the better. So in order to actually use these labels to train models, the first thing we have to do is deal with how to make sure that the model knows which object in the image each point annotation is associated with. So the first step that we do is converting the point labels to segmentation masks that are appropriate for training these deep learning-based models. And we do this in two different ways. The first way is by creating density labels, where we convolve a 7x7 Gaussian kernel with the point labels, and the resulting masks here are appropriate for training density estimation models. And the second way we do this is by creating binary masks by convolving a 7x7 maximum kernel with the point labels. And these are appropriate for training segmentation models. And here the figure on the right shows an approximation of this, where you're getting sort of a, you can imagine these red points as sort of blurred probability masks of where we think the cows would be given the point labels. And here the kernel size is really important and encodes our assumptions that the label noise, or the distance from the label to the actual object in the image, should be less than 7 pixels. And we chose this based on the results of preliminary experiments that we did. We then train a variety of different types of models using those two masks that we created. LCFCN, this is a state-of-the-art method in segmentation-based counting problems. CowNet, which is the name we gave to UNet with a multitask loss for doing the segmentation. Just a normal UNet, which is a very common semantic segmentation method in machine learning literature. CSRNet, which is a density estimation model, and FCRN, which is a different type of density estimation model. And now on to how we're actually evaluating the performance of this list of models. We have two types of metrics: counting-based metrics and localization-based metrics. And we are actually computing both of these metrics at a scene level. So for example, that large 30,000 by 30,000 image of point rays that I showed you, we want to evaluate on that entire scene to understand how our model is doing, even in locations where there aren't cows. If it's predicting a lot of false positives, that's a problem that we want to address, and we want to raise up through these metrics. So the counting-based metrics, we proposed gridded versions of mean, absolute error, and R-squared. And to compute these, you just do the following, which is illustrated here on the right-hand side of the slide. First, create a grid over the scene with some fixed resolution. So for example, 1 kilometer grid cells. You compare the predicted counts from the models to the actual counts over all grid cells, and you can do this with MAE or R-squared or any other metric. And then repeat with different sized grids. So vary that 1 kilometer value, which allows you to create plots like we're showing down here on the bottom of the slide, where you're seeing how the counting performance of your model changes as a function of the cell size over the area of interest. And this is really important, again, to understand how the model is performing at different resolutions, which is basically how it would be performing at doing a survey. Now, the second set of metrics are localization-based metrics, and this is a little bit more involved. Here, we want to group contiguous sets of positive predictions into objects and compare these objects with the ground truth point labels that we have. So a segmentation model output is going to say there's some group of pixels that it thinks are a cow, and we want to say whether or not that group of pixels is actually a cow or not. And the problem here is that due to the label noise and the fact that our objects are really, really small, it becomes easy to misclassify a prediction as a false positive or misclassify a label as a false negative. And to do this, we're illustrating this here with the figure on the right. If the yellow outlines are predicted objects and the green points are labels, you can see that it's possible to correctly segment a cow in the image without having any overlap with the label itself. In the other case, the predictions for multiple cows might be merged and cover 2 labels, so you need to have a way to deal with that as well. So to account for this kind of uncertainty in the labels and uncertainty in the predictions, we propose 2 methods for estimating the number of true positives, and false negatives, one being an optimistic method and one being a more conservative method. So for the optimistic method, we're just buffering each labeled point by some distance d, and any prediction within the buffer points is a true positive. Any prediction outside is a false positive, and a buffer point that doesn't intersect with the prediction is a false negative. And this is pretty intuitive. You're saying anything that's within 7 meters or 10 meters or d meters of one of our actual labeled points that a human annotator drew on the image. If you have an object within that radius, then it's good. And this, we call this optimistic, is because over predicting will not be penalized in any way. And then for the conservative estimate, you follow the same logic, but enforce that each prediction made by the model is paired with a single buffered label. And this is important because if a buffered label is covering multiple predictions, in the optimistic case, we say that's fine. Here in the conservative case, we say that's not fine, and we must choose one of the predicted objects that we're going to count actually as a true positive. I'm not going to go into more details, but you can interpret this problem as a maximum cardinality matching problem with one set of nodes representing labels, the other set representing predictions. So now on to results. We can compute metrics like precision and recall using the true positives and false positives with different buffer distances to better understand the true performance of the models. So these two plots show that value D that I was talking about, what range of noise we're going to allow for, influences the precision, which is similar to the number of false positives you have, and recall, which is the number of cows in the image that you're correctly identifying. And you can see that there's this sort of big jump when you have less than 5 meters. So if you wanted to understand the true performance of the model, you might select a value of D that's around here, and that would be a reasonable choice. So for experiments, we train on 7 scenes, validate on 1 scene, and test on 3 scenes in a temporal manner. We early stop based on validation loss, and then our actual evaluation measures are measuring temporal generalization, i.e. how well the models that we're training are going to perform in the future if we get more satellite imagery scenes over specifically point rays. Now, this is important to realize that this is saying nothing about how the models will generalize to other locations in the world for other satellite imagery sources or anything like that. This is specifically temporal generalization. And here we're showing the average test results over the 3 test scenes for those 5 sets, or the 5 different models that I mentioned earlier. The location metrics, so the last 2 columns were computed with a D of 4 meters, and the counting metrics were computed with a grid size of 100 meters. And the takeaway here is really that the LCFCN method is dominating the other models in the counting and localization metrics. And this is actually quite impressive. It's achieving a precision of around 0.6 and a recall anywhere between 0.8 and 0.9. The purely counting-based approaches aren't performing well at the 100-meter grid cell sizes, and they aren't actually able to localize objects at all. And the naive UNet approach over-segments the imagery, which means that it's predicting kind of cows everywhere. So it'll have very, very low precision. And here's the gridded R-squared value showing the ability of the models to count over different grid cell sizes. So as your grid cell size goes up, your performance usually increases as errors that you have are kind of canceling out. And the key point here is that the object-based models are performing very well at the larger cell sizes with R-squared values of over 0.8. So the actual count that the models are creating is highly correlated to the ground truth, or not the ground truth, but the labeled count that we have in the data. So to summarize, this work addressed the problem of detecting and counting cows in high-resolution satellite imagery. We proposed metrics for measuring the performance over large scenes with noisy labels, and then we benchmarked the temporal generalization performance of several different types of state-of-the-art models. And that's all I have. So thanks everyone so much for your time, and I'd love to answer questions with any time we have remaining.